Welcome back, Indiana Sports Beat Radio, here on this Monday. And you know what that means. The voice of the Hoosiers, Don Fischer, joins us. Don, it has been a good run for Indiana basketball, both men's and women's, to be honest with you. The women ranked number 2 in the country. The men continuing to rise up, whether you're talking about the net rankings, you're talking about the polls, but none of that matters because the eye test, they are rising in the eye test more and more every game. And it doesn't matter which side you're looking at, offense or defense. This weekend, it was defense without a question to me that made the difference. And it's because you didn't get a lot of offense from Miller Kopp, Trey Galloway, and those guys. But what they did not show up on the stat sheet. Miller Kopp probably largely responsible for shutting down Jet Howard in the second half after 9 first-half points. He goes, I think, 1 for 6 in the second half. Trey Galloway doing a great job, especially closing out toward the end. I think he made a couple of steals, and this team gutted out a win against a team that was desperate because that probably ended Michigan's chances for making the tournament this year.
Very possibly that's the case. There's little question that Indiana, here's what I gleaned out of this last week. Defense is the key. And we've always known that all the way through, but especially with this team, because offensively they can put points on the scoreboard, but when they're not scoring, defense travels, and defense is the difference maker. And in both these games this past week against Rutgers, earlier in the week, and then against Michigan this Saturday, the defense stepped up and they found a way to win ball games at the end, coming from behind in both of those contests. That to me is the most important thing that this team has, that you glean from this team right now. They figured out and they found ways to win ball games. If you are a good basketball program and you've got a program that is going to make any noise, it's at the defensive end of the floor that's the key, because we know they can score. I mean, there's no question about that. And your point about Miller Kopp, well, he did make a difference in the Rutgers ball game. He knocked down 18 points. He was a major factor in that ball game from a scoring perspective. But you're right. And Miller's defense this year, if you've watched him, he plays hard at the defensive end. He may not be the quickest or the most athletic guy on the court or the guy he's going up against, but he plays hard and he gets in their face. And I love that part about him because he is making a contribution aside from the fact that he's a great three-point shooter.
Don, we've talked about this in previous seasons. We talked about it during a stretch this season when we kind of questioned this team's toughness. And during this stretch where they've rattled off some big time wins, whether it be at home or on the road, the question has been about this team. What are you going to do? How are you going to respond when you get punched in the mouth? And you go back to Arizona, you go back to Kansas, even the first time they played Rutgers, they kind of rolled over. They had a chance to roll over against a Michigan team that was desperate, and they didn't. They had a chance to roll over when Purdue made a second half push, and they didn't. This team, I don't know what changed, but to me, for them to find their toughness, and right now when they're playing with that little bit of edge, and as you mentioned on the defensive end, they're playing as good as anybody in the country right now.
Well, and here's the other thing. They're playing without one of their best defensive players, and Xavier Johnson. So that's another factor to throw in there to make that is a positive for this basketball team, because they haven't had X since the Kansas ball game. And without him, you thought, well, that's going to be a real problem. And it was early on against Iowa, especially when Race went out in the second half of that ball game. And then you had the Northwestern, the Penn State debacles. And we're not saying that Indiana has to win those games or should win them. They should, but they didn't. In both of those instances. And they since that time, whatever the meeting that they had, I don't know if the players meeting had anything to do with it, but whatever Mike Woodson was telling those guys after those 3 losses, it's worked, because they have changed their whole mentality. There are guys in almost every ball game, somebody different steps up and plays an important factor or is an important factor in those ball games. And I think that is such an important factor. And the good news is they're doing it through injury issues with other players. Geronimo was out for 4 ball games. He comes back on Saturday against Michigan and contributes as a starter and played 20-some minutes in that contest. I thought he did a nice job in there, considering that he hadn't practiced all that much of late. Race Thompson's out of that ball game, so you don't have him to rely on, and he's dealing with another injury of some kind. So you've got different people stepping up in every ball game that they're playing. And Hood Schifino gets in foul trouble in the first half against Michigan and sits out a good portion of the first half and doesn't do much offensively, and he turns the ball over a bunch of times. I think he had 5 turnovers in the first half and only 1 in the second half. But when he came back on the floor at the end of the first half and he didn't want to get a third personal foul, he scores 4 field goals that gives them back in the contest. They were down 11. He comes back in and he knocks down 4 field goals that puts them within 4 points at halftime. Somebody continues to step up in each one of these situations, and it's somebody different almost every time, and that's what you really got to like about this team.
That is what makes this team dangerous, and that is what makes this team. Bob Kravitz was on with us last week. He's on every Wednesday, but last week he said that he expects Indiana to go further in the tournament than Purdue. And, of course, that would just rile Purdue fans up, as you would imagine. But I agree, and it's simply because look at yesterday. It's all you have to do. Look at the Indiana game. The reason they lose, it's not because Zach Edey does any less than he normally does, but it's their ancillary players, especially having 2 freshman guards, while they are tremendous and are going to be outstanding. And they're good right now. But because they're freshmen, they are susceptible to games like they had against Indiana, like they had yesterday, where the pressure gets to them and they folded in the late minutes of that game. And I think that's what will happen when they get into stages of the NCAA tournament. It's just the youth. Indiana's fortunate. They really don't have that except for Jalen Hood-Schifino, but he's a notch above. And Don, to me, his elevated play has been a big part of why Trace Jackson Davis is playing so explosively right now.
Well, Jackson Davis is the guy that has put this team on his back. There's no question about that, especially from an offensive perspective. But Jackson Davis is playing the best basketball of his career. This past week, he goes for 2,000 points, gets over 2,000 points and 1,000 rebounds, the first Indiana player to ever do that. He continues to climb the chart. He is 30 points away from surpassing Mike Woodson in the scoring column to become the 5th Indiana Hoosier in that position and pass Mike Woodson and put him in the 6th spot, which is kind of cool in that sense. But he's put this team on his back. And I think his leadership has improved so much over the last 4 years. And he is truly the leader of this basketball team. And you watch him out there. He's the guy that's gathering them up and, at free throw time and all this kind of stuff when things are going on out there, talks to them, makes sure that they know what they're supposed to be doing. He's a critical factor, but Hood Schifino is running this team as well from the point position. And the way Hood Schifino goes sometimes is the way this team goes. But even when he's had his bad ball games where he hasn't scored as much or been a factor, Jackson Davis is the guy who's there every single time. And to me, you've got to have that kind of leader on your basketball team. And I used to bellyache about that through the Archie Miller years, that they never had that alpha male guy. They didn't have the guy that took charge and got in somebody's face and told him to shut up and listen to the coach or whatever the case may be. We just haven't had that kind of guy. And I think Trace has taken on that role this year, and I think it's been a huge factor.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask, and not to put you on the spot, Don, but the way I watch Trace Jackson Davis play, in my mind, like, it's been a long time. I can't even name a player off the top of my head who has played as well and who has commanded the respect of every other team as much. Is there a player that comes to mind when you've watched him over these last, 12 to 15 ball games in an Indiana uniform? Because we've seen it throughout the Big Ten, but it seems like it's been so long since Indiana's had that kind of guy that
Juwan Morgan?
Juwan Morgan was a terrific leader too, but the last guy that put a team on his shoulders was Yogi Ferrell, in my opinion. I mean, I thought Yogi, his senior year was absolutely spectacular in every role that he played. as a leader, as a scorer, as a defensive player. I thought Yogi was terrific, and that's why they won the 2016 Big Ten title. It was because of Yogi Ferrell and his leadership and the way that he kind of gathered his teammates around him. He was the true leader of that team. So he's the last guy to be that guy. We've had other guys like that through the years. I mean, Buckner was the leader, obviously, of the team in 76 and 75 and 76 for that matter. You could go to Joe Hillman was a guy in 1989 that played at 6'3" and 205 pounds, whatever it was that he weighed, absolutely willed that team to victories along with Jay Edwards and Lyndon Jones, that group. But that was a team that nobody thought was going to win the Big Ten championship that year. There were 5 teams ahead of them at one point in the standings that everybody thought were better than Indiana was. And Indiana ended up winning the Big Ten championship that year because Joe Hillman was just a tough, no-nonsense.
He's tougher than nails. He's tougher than nails. I can't believe he's from California because he is as tough and as versed in Indiana basketball history as anybody I know. He knows it from the bottom up. When you talk to him, it's not that he's spouting it out. He just exudes that. It's like he was transplanted here and had a transplant of whatever the Indiana basketball DNA is. It was shot into him because anytime he's with us, man, you can tell he just has that, and he's tougher than nails. Was tougher than nails.
Yeah, there's no question. And he was guarding 6'6", 6'8", 6'7" guys every game. He was the third. He was a guard guarding forwards back in that 1989 season, and he did a phenomenal job. And because of that toughness that he showed, he became the leader of that team, and was a guy that had no problem in telling guys to shut up or you got to do this, you got to do that, whatever the case may be. And I think that's pretty much what we've seen out of Trace Jackson Davis, who is not only a leader, but he is taken on this team, and basically he is this leading scorer. He's the leading rebounder virtually every ball game that they play, and he's just been spectacular in that role. And you know, his numbers are proving out how good of and how valuable he is right now, because this team, had they not had Trace Jackson Davis, think about this season. It would have been.
Oh, yeah. And I hate to think back of what could have been for this season from a standpoint of the conference race. But with Northwestern knocking off Purdue, it's not opened the door for the conference championship, but it's put a crack in there. The door is not closed completely. And up next for Indiana, of course, is a trip to Evanston, where they lost last year amid the suspensions. But this is a team they lost to at home this year, and obviously is playing extraordinarily well, as now they're coming off a win over Purdue. I thought Indiana was going to win prior to them knocking off Purdue. Northwestern, that is. That makes it a little tougher, but I still think that Indiana can go there and win because of how they're playing. They play much better defense than, say, Purdue, and that is a huge difference. And I think that they're getting better contributions from people, even though in the scoring wise versus the other day it was Trace Jackson Davis and Jalen Chifino, but that's because I think those guys took the shots they needed to take. That was a game that they took what was brought to them. Indiana is like 300th in 3-point attempts, but they're like 16th in efficiency. So they're very particular and very efficient. And I think that it's working out very well for them. I think they can win there, but obviously that is going to be a tough environment, Don.
No question. It's going to be a huge challenge, but this team right now is, I think they are actually, what's the word? They're embracing these opportunities and these challenges. And I mean, they knew that Michigan was going to be a challenge on Saturday, and Michigan was playing for their life as far as the NCAA tournament was concerned. And that was going to be a crucial game for them. And the first half, they came out with their hair on fire, and Indiana didn't do a great job. I mean, I thought Indiana's defense was terrific, especially in the second half. But the first half, it wasn't very good until real late. And when they finally got a few stops in the first half of the ball game. But the second half, they met every challenge that Michigan threw at them. And then holding them without a field goal the last 5 minutes, or without a point the last 5+ minutes, was just spectacular defensive play. And it's the only reason they won the ball game, because the offense wasn't there at the end of the contest.
No, they didn't score the last 2 or 3 minutes either. So,
exactly.
But yeah, the defense, man, oh man, the stops they kept getting, I was like, wow. And again, to do that on the road against a team that was desperate, because they had been making a run to make the tournament and were probably heading in the right direction. They were heading in the right direction of doing that. If they win that game, boy, that would have really changed their fortunes. Now I think they're out. Northwestern now looking at making just their second tournament ever, Don, which that's without a doubt going to happen. Just where they're going to be is going to be a question. But Indiana also looking to bump their seed prospects for the tournament, and they need this win from a quad one standpoint. It continues to add to their resume. Although it's going to be a tough one, it would be a spectacular win to add to their growing resume.
Well, right now, I think this team doesn't have to focus on anything but this game. And it's when Mike Woodson has been talking about this for 2 years now, because it's coach speak, and yet it's true. You only worry about the next one up. You can't worry about the next one after that or the next one after that. You can't worry about where you're playing them. You've got to take one game at a time. And I know it just sounds so cliche and you hate it, but it's the reality. It is the reality of the situation. And players cannot get ahead of themselves. If they do, that's when they get into trouble. So, look, this Northwestern team is going to be a huge challenge. There's no question about that. I'm almost glad that they beat Purdue, because yes. I think if you watch that team celebrate that win on
big
Sunday,
emotional win, yeah,
it was the same thing that I was concerned about after Indiana beat Purdue. What kind of a letdown are they going to have emotionally, or did they expend so much energy it's going to be a problem? And you just don't know about that. But we do know this: the place will be packed. There will be a lot of Indiana fans in the stands, because there always are at Northwestern. There were a lot of Purdue fans in the stands yesterday at Northwestern. So those tickets are still being sold to other people. The Wildcat fans are still not there, but their student section has been awesome this year. And without question, it's going to be a challenge, and Indiana has to be ready for it. I think they will be. And especially now that Northwestern's tied with them for the Big Ten second place position. And let's face it, right now, what's everybody fighting for? They're fighting for one of those two buys in the Big Ten tournament. They don't want to play until Friday. And Indiana's one of those teams vying for one of those spots. And there's no question whether Indiana or whether Purdue falters at this point and loses a couple more times and makes it, maybe somebody can tie them for the Big Ten championship. We'll just have to wait and see. But you can't worry about that right now. You got to worry about the next man situation and who you're playing up. And it's going to be a tough challenge.